My father did not shake when he told the court I was not his biological daughter. He only shook when I dropped the second DNA file on the judge's desk. What could tear apart the Ward family's $5 billion empire was not just blood. It was a reproductive secret buried for nearly 4 decades, a backdated trust, and a man choosing pride over his child. They expected me to vanish, but ultimately, mine was not the name erased. My name is Harper Ward. I am 39 years old, and I am standing perfectly still in the center of the Court of Chancery in Wilmington. The air in this room is heavy, stale, and smells faintly of old legal volumes, polished mahogany, and the cold sweat of desperate men. We are not gathered here today to divide up a summer house or negotiate a modest corporate severance. We are fighting over absolute control. The prize sitting on the table is a controlling equity stake and exclusive voting rights over an empire valued at more than $5 billion. That empire is Ward Meridian Infrastructure. It is a massive, sprawling beast of concrete, steel, municipal water systems, and regional power grids spread across the nation. I know every inch of it. I built half of it with my bare hands. But today, the people I once called family are trying to strip it all away. My father sits exactly 20 feet away from me at the opposing council table. Conrad Ward, the founder. The ruthless patriarch who built the company from nothing. He wears a dark navy suit, tailored specifically to project unyielding authority. He slowly adjusts his silk tie. He looks past my shoulder. He looks directly at the presiding judge. When he opens his mouth to speak, I expect to hear a tremor. I expect to witness at least a sliver of hesitation from a man who is about to publicly destroy his own legacy. But his voice does not waver. It rings out, loud, cold, and entirely clear, bouncing off the high wooden walls of the courtroom. He states for the official court record that I am not his biological daughter. He declares that because of this lack of blood relation, I no longer have any legal right to the family trust. He demands I be permanently stripped of my controlling shares. He asks the court to sever me entirely from the company that bears my last name, treating me not as an heir, but as an elaborate mistake. The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. The entire courtroom goes dead. I can hear the low mechanical hum of the central air conditioning unit above us. I can hear the frantic clicking of the court reporter typing the exact letters of my ruin. Behind my table sits the gallery. It is packed to maximum capacity. There are New York investment bankers who hold our debt. There are high-powered corporate lawyers ready to pick the bones clean. There are several members of our own board of directors. There is the local and national financial press, pens hovering over their notepads. They all stop breathing at the exact same moment. They came here this morning expecting to watch a complex but standard legal dispute over corporate governance and board voting rights. They realize instantly that they are witnessing something much darker and far more brutal. This is not a family dispute over money. This is a public execution. My identity, my history, and my legitimacy are being slaughtered on the public record for everyone to see. I turn my head slightly and look across the wide aisle. Evelyn Cross Ward sits perfectly still next to my father. She is his second wife. She is dressed in a slate gray designer suit, her hands folded primly in her lap. She plays the role of the solemn, deeply concerned spouse with absolute perfection, but her eyes give her away. There is a deep, venomous, and unmistakable satisfaction gleaming in them. She has waited years for this exact second. She has manipulated the board members behind my back, whispered poison in my father's ear every night, and laid the meticulous legal groundwork for my destruction. Beside her sits her own son, Miles Cross. He is 32 years old. He is not a Ward. He has never poured a single ounce of sweat into the soil of a Ward Meridian construction site. He has never read an engineering report or stayed awake for 3 days to fix a failing municipal grid. Yet he sits up perfectly straight. His chin is tilted up arrogantly. He looks exactly like a vulture who has just spotted a bleeding carcass in the desert. He is staring at the invisible throne of the company, firmly believing the $5 billion is finally legally his. Conrad's lead counsel steps forward. He is a tall, sharp-featured man who specializes in tearing rich families apart for a percentage of the wreckage. He holds a single sheet of paper in his right hand. It is a piece of paper designed to erase my entire existence. He submits it to the judge with a theatrical, condescending flourish. He announces to the silent room that it is a shortened DNA test result, a highly targeted medical document. He reads the scientific conclusion aloud, ensuring every reporter hears it clearly. It proves there is absolutely zero biological connection between Conrad Ward and myself. 0% match. The lawyer does not stop there. He pushes the blade in much deeper. He formally demands the court activate the bloodline clause. It is a newly drafted legal amendment. Evelyn and her team of lawyers secretly slipped it into the family trust documents just a few months ago, burying it under hundreds of pages of financial jargon. It explicitly stipulates that only direct biological descendants can hold voting shares or serve on the executive board. It is a trap built specifically for me. Only true blood can control the empire. The heavy silence in the room stretches out, thick and suffocating. They all wait for the collapse. They expect me to shatter into a million pieces. Evelyn leans forward just a fraction of an inch, her eyes wide, waiting to see the tears spill down my face. Miles smirks openly, waiting for the panic to set in and destroy my composure. They want me to vehemently deny it. They want me to scream at the judge that it is a vicious, fabricated lie. They want a hysterical, broken woman they can pity, patronize, and easily dismiss from the room. I do not give them a single drop of satisfaction. I do not panic. My pulse does not even spike. I have spent my entire adult life managing massive infrastructure crises. I have stood in the freezing rain at 3 o'clock in the morning to stop toxic chemical spills. I have negotiated hostile takeovers with men far more dangerous and intelligent than Miles Cross. I do not break in front of men in expensive suits. I do not shatter because of a piece of paper designed to scare me. I slowly rise from my chair. My movements are deliberate, measured, and heavily controlled. I look directly at the judge. I keep my voice entirely level, stripping it of all emotion, anger, and fear. I simply request the right to present my full and complete evidence before this court formally accepts a manufactured half-truth as a ruling legal fact. The judge looks down at me from his bench. He seems slightly taken aback by my absolute, unnatural calm. He nods slowly and grants the request, gesturing for me to proceed. I reach down to the carpeted floor beneath my heavy oak table. My fingers wrap securely around the brass handle of a black leather file box. It is exceptionally heavy. It holds nearly 4 decades of buried history, sealed medical records, and silent family betrayals. I lift it up with both hands and place it directly onto the center of the table. The sound it makes is a heavy, decisive thud that echoes loudly in the quiet room. The entire dynamic in the courtroom fractures instantly. I watch Evelyn closely. Her polite, heavily controlled mask slips for a fraction of a second. Her eyes dart nervously toward the black box. Her mind calculates furiously, trying to understand what weapon I could have possibly brought to a fight she thought was already over. She wonders what I could have possibly found in the dark corners of the family archives. Then, I look directly at Conrad. For the first time today, my father actually meets my gaze. He thought this would be a very clean kill. He thought I would be far too humiliated, deeply ashamed, and emotionally destroyed to even attempt to fight back. He looks at the black leather box sitting on my table. The smug, righteous certainty completely drains from his aging face. His skin turns a pale, sickly shade of gray. It is not the look of a victorious patriarch securing his legacy. It is the look of a man who is utterly terrified of his own past. The judge picks up his heavy wooden gavel and strikes it against the sounding block. He formally calls for a short recess to allow the court adequate time to examine the newly submitted physical evidence. The sharp, violent crack of the wood completely breaks the spell holding the room hostage. People immediately stand up. The frantic whispers begin to fill the gallery, rising rapidly in volume like a massive swarm of hissing snakes. Reporters scramble desperately for their phones to text their editors. Investment bankers lean in close to whisper furiously to each other about dropping stock prices. I remain standing perfectly still by my table. My right hand rests flat against the cold leather lid of the heavy box. Today was supposed to be the day they erased me from the Ward family. They thought they had finally backed me into a corner with absolutely no chance of escape. But they made a massive, fatal miscalculation. I know exactly what is buried inside this box. And as I watch my father quickly turn his back and practically flee the courtroom to avoid looking at me, I understand one profound thing with absolute clarity. Today, if a long-buried secret has to die in this courtroom, I will make absolutely sure it does not die alone. I grew up in the quiet, sprawling suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, long before the name Ward meant anything to the power brokers on Wall Street. In those early days, our company was barely a blip on the radar of national infrastructure developers. We were a strictly local operation, consisting of a fleet of 6 beaten-down utility trucks and a cramped, intensely hot office located directly above a failing roadside diner. The diner smelled constantly of burnt coffee and cheap frying oil, a scent that still vividly reminds me of our first major municipal contract. We handled the absolute dirty work. We managed local water treatment upgrades, patched together aging, highly dangerous electrical grids, and took on the ugly, miserable civil engineering contracts that the massive construction firms refused to even look at. We were the scavengers of the infrastructure world, building a massive foundation out of the scraps left behind by others. My mother, Claire Ward, was the silent, brilliant engine that kept the entire machine running. She did not wear a hard hat or pour concrete, but she was the absolute brain of the operation. I spent my childhood evenings sitting on the worn living room rug, watching her hunched over our heavy oak dining table. She was always surrounded by towering stacks of vendor invoices, thick payroll ledgers, and heavily marked up municipal tax forms. She worked late into the night, her reading glasses slipping down her nose, making sure every single cent was accounted for. She taught me very early on that a lasting empire is never built on brute force or aggressive corporate expansion alone. It is built and sustained by flawlessly clean financial records and absolute, unwavering promises. She told me that if you tell a city council you will fix a ruptured main line by Tuesday morning, you make sure the water is running clear by Monday night, even if you have to dig the freezing trench with your own bare hands. The man my father used to be was entirely different from the polished executive he is today. Back then, Conrad was a tough, deeply calloused man whose heavy leather work boots were perpetually caked in gray mud, dried cement, and machine oil. He was intensely reliable, a man of very few words but massive, undeniable action. On weekends, instead of taking me to the park or the movies like other fathers did with their daughters, he would drop a bright yellow safety vest over my small shoulders and drive me out to the active work zones. I learned to read complex architectural blueprints before I could comfortably ride a bicycle. I learned to listen to the deep, rhythmic thumping of industrial water pumps to know if the pressure was holding steady or about to blow. I learned to recognize the sharp, acidic, metallic smell of hot steel being welded in the damp morning air. He taught me that real authority does not come from a fancy title printed on a frosted glass door. It comes from the willingness to walk right into the mud and fix the exact things that everyone else has abandoned. I never intended to simply inherit my position at the top of the company. When I left Richmond to study operational finance, I spent 4 brutal years grinding through heavy textbooks and incredibly complex case studies. When I finally returned home to the company, I flatly refused the comfortable, high-paying executive chair my father immediately offered me. I did not want the veteran crews to see me as the boss's pampered child playing at business. I demanded a small, windowless desk down in the risk management department. It was the least glamorous, highest stress sector of the entire business. Over the next 10 years, I slowly became the person the board sent in to stop the bleeding. I personally rescued 3 separate regional branches that were hemorrhaging millions of dollars due to terrible local management and bloated vendor contracts. I flew out to Nevada and personally managed the crisis protocol, when an unforeseen environmental disaster at a pipeline nearly wiped out our entire Western Division. I sat in incredibly hostile town hall meetings, facing furious local citizens, while our corporate lawyers urged me to hide behind generic public relations statements. Among the veteran crews, the heavy machinery operators, and the old foreman, I was never known as the heiress. They knew me as the woman who would drive out to a collapsed water treatment facility at 3 o'clock in the morning in the middle of a freezing rainstorm. I knew the first names of the chief engineers. I knew which ones had sick wives and which ones had kids starting college. I made it a strict, unbreakable personal rule that I would never sign my name to a single corporate directive or a massive budget cut until I had physically stood on the dirt and completely understood the real-world consequences of that decision. We were building a legacy together, piece by piece, steel beam by steel beam. It felt incredibly solid. It felt like I truly belonged there, woven permanently into the very fabric of the company my parents built. But even the strongest foundations can crack if the pressure shifts. The fracture in our family did not start with a hostile corporate takeover or a bad quarterly earnings report. It started with a quiet, devastating medical diagnosis. My mother fought her illness for 4 grueling, painful years. It was a slow, agonizing process of fading away that steadily drained the warmth and the light out of our home. When she finally passed away, she left behind a massive, silent void. It was not a loud or chaotic emptiness, but a heavy, suffocating stillness that completely destroyed the daily rhythm of our lives. Without her steady hand to guide him, the balance in my father broke entirely. Conrad did not openly mourn. He simply shut off all access to his heart. He poured all of his unprocessed grief into rapid, aggressive, and highly risky corporate expansion. He became significantly colder. He spoke in much shorter sentences. He worked later and later into the night, refusing to come home to a quiet house. He began to treat all human emotion, including his own profound grief, as a severe operational weakness that needed to be ruthlessly eradicated from his system. 2 years later, Evelyn walked into our fractured lives. She was undeniably beautiful, immaculately polished, and possessed a terrifyingly precise ability to read the emotional temperature of any room she entered. She never raised her voice. She never made blatant demands. She was an absolute master of the soft, comforting approach. She spoke constantly about healing, about finding peace, and about bringing joy back into my father's tired life. But every single sentence she spoke, every gentle suggestion she made, was a carefully calculated move designed to subtly shift the balance of power. She would gently suggest we change the caterers for the annual company holiday party, entirely erasing the loyal local vendors my mother had used for 2 decades. She would softly convince my father that he needed a private study on the far side of the estate, slowly isolating him from the rest of the house and from me. She would host intimate dinners for key members of our board of directors while I was out of state dealing with a crisis. She would pour them expensive wine and tell them with a sympathetic sigh that I was simply working too hard and needed to be protected from executive stress. She painted me as an overworked, fragile workaholic while perfectly positioning herself as the steady, nurturing guardian of the Ward legacy. From the very moment she unpacked her designer bags, the heavy brass mailbox at the end of the long driveway still carried the Ward family name. The property deed remained exactly the same in the county records. The massive oak front door had not changed, but the air inside those hallways had fundamentally changed owners. The warmth of my mother was completely scrubbed away, replaced by the sterile, perfectly curated perfection of a woman who saw us not as a family, but as a hostile acquisition. I just did not realize I was standing in deeply enemy territory until it was entirely too late. Evelyn never launched a frontal assault against me. That was simply not her preferred method of warfare. Frontal assaults leave visible casualties and undeniable evidence. She operated much more like a slow-acting chemical solvent, silently dissolving the structural integrity of my authority so quietly that absolutely no one noticed the steel weakening until it was ready to collapse. She began her campaign with gentle, seemingly harmless suggestions over lavish Sunday dinners. She would pour my father a glass of expensive red wine and softly suggest that a man of his incredible stature needed a dedicated family office to properly manage his growing personal wealth. She murmured that our traditional corporate headquarters felt slightly outdated, perhaps a little too blue-collar for a modern multi-billion-dollar enterprise. And most dangerously of all, she continually suggested that her son, Miles, who was barely 23 years old at the time and completely devoid of any real-world achievements, was simply brimming with untapped executive potential. Before I could fully process the shifting tectonic plates beneath my feet, Miles was awarded a newly created title in the digital strategy division. The boy had absolutely no engineering background. He had never overseen a municipal budget or managed a field crew, yet within 6 short months, he bypassed a dozen senior managers and leapfrogged directly into the executive finance wing. Shortly after that, he took over the Family Philanthropic Foundation. I was forced to sit in high-level strategy meetings and watch him present slick, heavily animated presentation decks to our board members. He spoke in endless, dizzying circles of trendy corporate buzzwords, talking confidently about synergy, digital disruption, and agile operational frameworks. But he did not know the current market price for a ton of raw industrial steel. He did not know the crushing regulatory hurdles required to pour foundation concrete in a designated state wetland. He was exceptionally gifted at making colorful pie charts look important, but if you dropped him onto an active construction site, he would not know how to tell a backup generator from a high-pressure water pump. The erosion of my own standing within the company began with the smallest, most easily dismissible infractions. For over a decade, the preliminary quarterly risk assessment reports had always landed on my heavy wooden desk first. It was my job to find the hidden liabilities before they became public disasters. Suddenly, those same reports were being routed directly to a brand new advisory committee that Evelyn had personally helped select. When I aggressively questioned the finance department about the change, they nervously told me it was simply a new streamlined corporate protocol. Then came the infuriating issue with my executive signature. I had held unilateral sign-off authority for regional crisis interventions for many years. It was a necessity for moving fast in an emergency. One morning, a critical requisition form for emergency earth-moving equipment was kicked back to my inbox. A new internal software flag required a mandatory co-approval from the Office of the Vice President of Strategy. That office belonged to Miles. I was essentially being told that I had to ask a 20-something amateur for permission to fix the bleeding wounds of the company I had spent my entire adult life protecting. Furthermore, critical executive steering committee meetings began materializing on the corporate calendar completely out of nowhere. Oddly enough, they only ever seemed to be scheduled for the exact days I was on a commercial airplane flying to a distant site inspection, or when I was locked in a windowless room handling hostile negotiations with regional labor unions. They were making massive decisions about the future of the company, while ensuring I was physically unable to be in the room to object. The true depth of the rot became glaringly apparent when Arthur Vance was quietly forced into an early retirement. Arthur was the ironclad legal advisor who had sat across the table from my mother for 20 years. He was fiercely loyal, and he knew exactly where every single financial skeleton was buried. He was abruptly replaced by a sleek, aggressively modern attorney from a massive corporate firm, a man entirely handpicked by Evelyn. It took less than 8 months for this new legal team to initiate a comprehensive review of the family trust documents. I did not even see the revised legal drafts until they were already officially filed with the state. Buried deep on page 47, hiding under a dense, unreadable thicket of tax mitigation clauses, was a brand new, incredibly vague phrase regarding the eventual distribution of executive voting shares. The phrase was the preservation of biological lineage. I confronted my father the very next day. I walked straight into his newly renovated corner office, demanding a clear explanation for this sudden obsession with genealogy in our corporate bylaws. He did not even bother to look up from his mahogany desk. He casually waved his hand in the air, dismissing my genuine anger as a dramatic overreaction. He told me the world was changing rapidly. He claimed the board of directors simply demanded a clearer, more heavily fortified succession structure to protect the shareholders from future legal liabilities. He looked me right in the eye and said it was just standard legal boilerplate. Absolutely nothing for me to lose sleep over. He delivered this incredibly hollow, insulting excuse on the exact same afternoon I had just returned from a brutal trip to Arizona. I had spent 72 straight hours awake in a sweltering Phoenix conference room, desperately salvaging a massive municipal transit contract that the new strategy team led by Miles had completely botched. I had single-handedly saved the firm tens of millions of dollars in penalties, and my only reward was a quiet, legal demotion hidden in the fine print of a document I was not allowed to read. The final, devastating turn of the knife happened during a closed-door session of the board of directors. It was a rainy Tuesday morning. The boardroom was packed with the new advisors and friendly faces Evelyn had systematically installed over the past 2 years. Without any prior warning on the printed agenda, the chairman of the board introduced a formal motion to restructure the risk and operational oversight committees. In a matter of 20 agonizing minutes, I was formally stripped of my sole chairmanship of the strategy committee. The chairman, using the most nauseatingly polite and diplomatic language possible, announced that moving forward, I would be sharing executive authority with Miles Cross. They publicly called it a collaborative synergy initiative. It was a staggering public humiliation wrapped tightly in the suffocating plastic of corporate etiquette. I was being told by a room full of men in expensive suits to share the steering wheel with a child while driving a heavy rig down a steep mountain at 80 miles an hour. I looked at my father across the long, polished table. He simply stared down at his notepad, refusing to meet my gaze while my authority was carved up and handed to his stepson. Late that evening, long after the glass towers of the financial district had emptied out and the city grew quiet, I walked down to the industrial maintenance yards. I needed to smell diesel fuel and wet dirt to remind myself what was actually real. I ran into an old yard foreman named Thomas. He was a grizzled, exhausted man who had been pouring cement since my mother was balancing the books by hand in that hot room above the diner. He saw the cold, hollow look on my face. He wiped his thick, greasy hands on a shop rag and leaned heavily against a chain-link fence. He looked at me with sad, tired eyes and told me a very hard truth. He said a company like ours never collapses because a rival contractor outbids us on a job or because the national economy takes a bad turn. He said an empire only falls apart when the people living safely inside the castle start treating the brick and mortar as more important than the people who bled to build it. Standing there in the freezing night air, under the harsh yellow glow of the security lights, the reality of my situation finally crystallized into something terrifying. I was not just dealing with a standard power struggle over board seats. I was not just losing a clash of management styles. Evelyn and Miles were not just trying to push me away from the head of the table. They were systematically preparing to erase me from the legacy. I was being prepped to be wiped completely out of the history of the company my mother died building. The first crack in the fortress walls did not come from a medical laboratory or a shocking courtroom confession. It came from a deeply buried spreadsheet. In the brutal world of corporate infrastructure, you learn very quickly that people can lie with incredible ease, but money always leaves a definitive, undeniable trail. Late one evening, long after the heavy rain had washed the city streets clean, I received an encrypted, anonymous message. It was from a senior financial controller who had quietly balanced the internal accounting books for our company for over 30 years. We met in the damp, dimly lit sub-basement of a municipal parking garage. He was absolutely terrified. He kept looking over his shoulder, his hands trembling slightly as he handed me a single, unmarked manila envelope. Inside the envelope was a highly classified, heavily redacted printed ledger detailing my father's private discretionary spending over the past several decades. He pointed a shaking finger to a recurring line item buried deep within the miscellaneous personal expenses. It was a modest automated bank transfer, roughly $3,000, executed flawlessly on the 15th of every single month. For a man whose net worth hovered around $5 billion, it was the exact equivalent of loose change lost between the cushions of a sofa. But the relentless consistency of the payment over nearly 40 years caught the controller's highly trained, paranoid eye. I traced the routing numbers. The money was being funneled directly to a defunct corporate entity registered as the Arbor Reproductive Institute Archives. It was a specialized biomedical storage facility that had officially filed for bankruptcy and dissolved its public operations in the late 1990s. Yet, my father was still quietly paying them every single month. He was paying to keep something frozen, locked away, and heavily guarded. It was a payment you would never notice unless you specifically knew exactly what you were looking for. The very next morning, I arrived at the corporate headquarters hours before the sun came up. I bypassed the standard security protocols and logged directly into our heavily fortified internal corporate network. I used a backdoor administrative credential I had secretly established years ago during a massive system overhaul. I began to cross-reference the family office financial records with the central legal document repository. The results chilled me to the bone. Entire directories had been systematically purged. More specifically, a massive cluster of physical legal dockets dating back to the exact year I was born had been permanently removed from the basement archives. When I tried to pull the digital backups, my monitor flashed with a harsh, glaring red banner reading restricted access. Evelyn and her newly appointed legal team were not just building a defensive wall. They were actively burning the historical bridges behind them, ensuring that whatever happened in the year of my birth remained completely inaccessible to me. I realized instantly that I could not fight this battle using the company's internal counsel. The building was already compromised. I needed a total outsider. I needed someone absolutely ruthless, a predator who hunted in the dark. I hired a private litigator named Naomi Sloan. Naomi operated out of a stark, aggressively minimalist office on the edge of the financial district, entirely devoid of warmth, family photographs, or personal charm. She did not engage in friendly, polite banter. She spoke in incredibly sharp, economic sentences that cut straight through the noise and directly to the bone. She possessed a terrifying, almost surgical ability to locate the exact sliver of gray space between what was technically legal and what was fundamentally moral. More importantly, she knew exactly how to exploit that microscopic gap until the entire opposition shattered into a million pieces. I laid out the financial ledgers, the routing numbers, and the digital server logs across her pristine glass desk. Naomi did not express shock. She barely even blinked. She simply reviewed the documents with cold, calculating eyes. She told me that Evelyn was meticulously setting the stage for a permanent erasure. She stated that if we wanted to survive the coming slaughter, we needed to find whatever my father was paying to keep hidden before the opposing counsel could weaponize it against me. That stark directive led us completely away from the towering glass skyscrapers of the city and out to a bleak, wind-swept, fiercely isolated stretch of the Virginia coastline. My mother had quietly purchased a small, deeply weathered beach house decades ago through an untraceable blind trust. It was her private, heavily guarded sanctuary. It was a place she never once mentioned to Evelyn and rarely ever discussed with my father. It was the only piece of real estate in the entire family portfolio that Evelyn had not yet managed to infiltrate or completely inventory. Naomi and I drove for 5 hours in total silence. When we arrived, the air tasted heavy with salt and impending storm clouds. We spent 2 agonizingly slow, exhausting days tearing through the dusty, damp interior of that house. We meticulously sifted through heavy cardboard boxes filled with old tax receipts, faded architectural photographs, and moth-eaten sweaters that still faintly smelled of her perfume. Late on the second night, deep inside the absolute bottom drawer of an antique wooden dresser, buried beneath a heavy pile of thick winter blankets, my hands hit solid metal. It was a rusted, heavy iron lockbox. We spent another hour tearing the bedroom apart until we found a tiny, tarnished brass key hidden inside the hollowed-out spine of a thick hardback novel. I took a deep, shaky breath and turned the key. The lock finally clicked open with a sharp, echoing snap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. Empty house. Inside the box, The trapped air smelled of stale, decaying paper and ancient, desperate secrets. Laying on top was an unsent letter, written in my mother's unmistakable, elegant, sweeping handwriting. Beneath the letter was a faded, deeply crinkled invoice from a specialized fertility clinic. The date printed at the top was exactly 9 months before my birth. My eyes scanned the billing details, searching frantically for a name. The space where the biological donor's name should have been clearly typed was left entirely blank, but the most damning, terrifying piece of evidence was hidden at the very bottom. It was a heavily degraded, low-quality photocopy of a legally binding confidentiality agreement. The final page, the crucial page containing the formalized, witnessed signatures, had been violently and deliberately torn away, leaving behind only jagged paper edges. In the narrow margins of the remaining pages, my mother had frantically scribbled dozens of fragmented notes. She had obsessively circled one specific name over and over again in thick, heavy blue ink, pressing so hard the pen had nearly torn through the fragile paper. The name was Andrew Ward. I sat back on the dusty wooden floor, staring at the letters until they began to blur together. I knew Andrew was my father's much younger brother, but he was essentially a ghost. He had passed away many years ago under incredibly tragic, highly guarded, and deliberately unspoken circumstances. His name was strictly forbidden at our dinner table. He was entirely erased from the joyful family anecdotes, reduced to a silent, tragic phantom hovering at the very edges of our corporate dynasty. I had absolutely no logical idea how a deceased, estranged uncle connected to a hidden biomedical storage fee, a restricted corporate server, and a torn fertility contract. But the intense, icy dread rapidly pooling in my stomach told me the connection was profound, dangerous, and likely devastating to everything I thought I knew. Naomi did not offer any comforting words. She carefully, methodically placed the fragile, aging documents into a clear plastic evidence sleeve. Her face remained a perfect, entirely unreadable mask of pure calculation. She looked directly at me and delivered her final instructions with cold, mechanical precision. She demanded I submit to a comprehensive, full-spectrum genealogical DNA test the very next morning. She explicitly stated we needed an ancestral sequencing designed to map exact familial branching, not just a simple paternity swab. She warned me, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper, that my father and Evelyn were currently holding a highly volatile, weaponized half-truth. If they dragged that half-truth into a courtroom, it would completely and permanently destroy me. She said that if they were preparing to bury us alive with a lie of omission, our only possible chance of survival was to dig up the absolute, terrifying truth before the earth was permanently packed down over our heads. The first envelope from the private laboratory arrived on a remarkably ordinary Thursday morning. I sat opposite Naomi in her freezing, aggressively minimalist office, watching the heavy city traffic crawl along the gray streets far below us. She slid the sealed white folder across the pristine glass surface. I opened it with completely steady hands. The initial summary paragraph confirmed the absolute cruelest reality. It was the exact narrative Evelyn and her legal team were currently drinking expensive champagne to celebrate. There was zero direct biological link between my father and me. Looking at that stark, scientifically irrefutable conclusion printed in harsh black ink, I felt a sudden, violent severing in my chest. It was the physical sensation of a heavy steel cable snapping under immense pressure. But Naomi did not hire a standard laboratory to perform a basic paternity swab. She had demanded a highly advanced, full-spectrum genealogical sequencing designed to map out exact familial branching across multiple generations. As she flipped to the heavily detailed appendices at the back of the thick report, her cold, calculating eyes narrowed. She pointed a sharp fingernail at a glaring, massive anomaly buried deep within the complex genetic markers. The sequencing revealed an incredibly high, undeniable percentage of shared genetic material between myself and Judith Mercer. Judith was my father's estranged older sister, a woman who had lived quietly on the West Coast for the past 30 years. The DNA overlap extended flawlessly to Judith's 2 adult children. It was a statistical and biological impossibility for me to share that exact concentration of genetic markers with my aunt and cousins if I were truly a complete stranger to their family tree. I was absolutely not an outsider. I was simply resting on an entirely different, heavily concealed branch of the exact same bloodline. Armed with this newly discovered biological tether, Naomi unleashed a terrifying wave of aggressive legal subpoenas. She bypassed the heavily guarded corporate servers entirely and targeted the deeply buried state-level medical archives from the late 1980s. What she managed to drag out of the dark was not a story of a cheating wife or a broken marriage. It was a profound, suffocating portrait of old-fashioned, toxic American masculine shame. The records proved that several years before he even met my mother, my father had suffered a severe, highly complicated medical trauma. The resulting diagnosis was absolute, irreversible sterility. For a man who was rapidly building a reputation as a ruthless, self-made industrial titan, a man whose entire public persona was wrapped in rugged, unyielding masculinity, this medical reality was utterly devastating. He could force thousands of tons of concrete and steel into the sky, but he was physically incapable of producing a biological heir. He viewed it as a catastrophic personal failure, a fundamental weakness that his aggressive corporate rivals would mercilessly mock if it ever saw the light of day. My mother loved him deeply during those early years. She desperately wanted a child, but more importantly, she wanted to save his fracturing ego and preserve their marriage. She quietly orchestrated the highly confidential visits to the Arbor Reproductive Institute. But she absolutely refused to utilize an anonymous, untraceable medical donor. She knew my father's intense, borderline obsessive pride would never allow him to look at a child carrying the blood of a complete stranger and call it his own. The shocking truth we unearthed from the fragmented clinic logs was that they kept the solution entirely within the family. The donor was his younger brother, Andrew. Andrew was everything my father was not. He was incredibly quiet, deeply introspective, and entirely uninterested in the brutal, cutthroat world of municipal infrastructure and corporate takeovers. He lived a fiercely private life, but he possessed a profound, unwavering loyalty to my mother and his older brother. The newly recovered legal notes from the defunct clinic indicated that Andrew only agreed to this incredibly complex arrangement under one absolute, unbreakable condition. He legally demanded that I be raised completely and unconditionally as my father's true daughter. I was never to be told the truth, and my existence was never to be used as a bargaining chip in any future family dispute or boardroom negotiation. He donated his future to save his brother's pride, and then he quietly stepped back into the shadows until his tragic death years later. The most critical piece of the puzzle, the exact document that Evelyn and her expensive lawyers had desperately tried to burn, was a heavily witnessed, notarized medical consent form. Naomi secured a certified copy from the State Health Department archives. It bore my father's distinct, aggressive signature in thick black ink. By legally signing that specific document, he formally consented to the assisted reproductive procedure using his brother's genetic material. Naomi looked at me across the desk, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register. She explained that under the strict letter of state law, a man who voluntarily signs a medical consent form for donor conception is the absolute, irrefutable legal parent, period. He could not suddenly disown me nearly 4 decades later simply because we lacked a direct biological link. The law did not care about his injured pride. It only cared about his signature. Sitting in that cold office, the entire history of my family suddenly rearranged itself into a devastating new clarity. I finally understood my mother's profound, agonizing silence. She knew that revealing this secret would completely destroy my father's fragile, carefully constructed myth of absolute masculine supremacy. She knew it would shatter his ego and inevitably distort my entire life. So she bore the heavy weight of the lie completely alone. She locked the truth away in a rusted iron box in a damp beach house, praying it would never see the light of day. But she was brilliant, and she was fiercely protective. She kept the receipts. She preserved the fractured trail of evidence specifically for this exact moment. knowing deep in her bones that one day, my father's toxic pride and cowardice might eventually outweigh his love for me. I closed my eyes and vividly recalled the exact expression on his face back in the Wilmington courtroom. When I had placed that heavy black leather box on the table, he had turned a sickly shade of gray. At the time, I thought I was looking at a man who was terrified of an unknown threat. But now I knew the absolute truth. His face in that courtroom was not the face of a betrayed, heartbroken victim who had just discovered his daughter was a stranger. It was the terrified, pathetic face of a man who had known the medical truth all along. He knew exactly how I was conceived. He had signed the paperwork himself. Yet, when his ruthless new wife handed him an easy, legally convenient way to push me out of the company and secure her own son's future, he took it. He actively chose to sit perfectly still in a packed courtroom and allow his own flesh and blood to be publicly slaughtered. He chose to let the world believe my mother was a liar and I was an illegitimate mistake, all to protect his peers from discovering he was sterile. He was willing to burn my entire life to the ground simply to save his own artificial honor. The profound, paralyzing heartbreak I had felt all week completely evaporated in that exact second. It was instantly replaced by something much darker, much colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The strategic leak happened exactly as Evelyn had meticulously planned it. By the time the financial markets opened on Monday morning, the incredibly toxic rumor of the illegitimate heir was already bleeding heavily across the national business news wires. It did not take long for the massive institutional partner banks and several of the more conservative, panic-prone board members to start placing frantic phone calls to the executive suite. They heavily questioned the fundamental stability of our entire corporate succession plan. Stock prices for our publicly traded subsidiaries began a slow, terrifying slide downward. This was Evelyn's ultimate strategy playing out in real time. She wanted the chaos. She needed the board of directors to view me not as a seasoned, reliable executive who had saved the company countless times, but as a deeply unstable, illegitimate liability who needed to be swiftly removed to restore critical market confidence. They expected me to retreat into my apartment, completely devastated and paralyzed by the severe public humiliation. They expected tears, a frantic legal defense, or an emotionally unhinged press conference begging for sympathy. Instead, I went completely cold. I locked myself inside a highly secure, off-site war room with Naomi Sloan and a newly hired squad of the most aggressive, utterly ruthless forensic accountants operating on the eastern seaboard. I did not waste a single second grieving a father who never truly existed. I immediately weaponized my profound grief and turned it into a highly calibrated corporate audit. I directed my team to forensically dismantle every single financial maneuver made within the Ward Meridian ecosystem over the last 36 months. We did not look at the heavy construction contracts or the massive municipal bids I had personally negotiated. We looked exclusively at the shadows. We tore into the recent legal amendments made to the family trust. We ripped apart the private charitable foundation ledgers. And most importantly, we aggressively audited every single consulting contract that Miles Cross had authorized since he magically ascended to his unearned vice president chair. It took the forensic team less than 48 hours to find the bleeding artery. Hidden deep beneath thick layers of overly complex corporate jargon and intentionally confusing tax mitigation structures, we discovered a vendor named Blue Basin Strategies. Over the past 2 years, our family philanthropic foundation had quietly funneled roughly $4 million directly into Blue Basin bank accounts. The approved invoices claimed the money was for high-level digital synergy consulting, advanced demographic analytics, and corporate restructuring seminars. But when my private investigators physically visited the registered corporate address listed on the tax forms, they found absolutely nothing but an empty, dusty room located above a failing strip mall in suburban New Jersey. Blue Basin produced 0 tangible reports. They developed 0 proprietary software. They provided 0 actual services to our company. The final, fatal puzzle piece snapped into place when Naomi successfully pulled the state incorporation documents for Blue Basin. The sole registered proprietor of this completely fraudulent consulting firm was a man who happened to be Miles Cross's former college roommate. Naomi stood over the sprawling physical spreadsheet we had taped to the wall, her cold eyes gleaming with the terrifying thrill of a predator smelling blood in the water. She turned to me and clearly articulated the true, horrifying scope of Evelyn's master plan. The sudden, violent obsession with genetic purity and the public weaponization of the DNA test was never just about stripping me of my rightful inheritance out of spite. It was a massive, highly calculated smokescreen. Evelyn desperately needed me entirely removed from the executive floor because I was the only person in the entire building who possessed the operational knowledge and the security clearance to realize they were actively siphoning millions of dollars right out of the family ecosystem. The illegitimate child scandal was simply the flashy distraction they used to keep everyone looking the other way while they were busy robbing the vault. Late that same afternoon, my secure phone rang. It was my father's private secretary requesting a highly confidential, strictly off-the-record meeting. We met on the 42nd floor of the corporate tower in a massive, completely empty glass conference room. The city stretched out below us, completely ignorant of the empire silently collapsing high above it. Conrad Ward stood near the floor-to-ceiling window, refusing to look me in the eye when I walked through the heavy wooden doors. He looked suddenly incredibly old, heavily burdened by the immense weight of the lies he was desperately trying to keep afloat. He did not apologize for the brutal courtroom ambush. He did not offer any emotional explanation for his decades of complete silence regarding his brother Andrew. Instead, he slowly walked over to the long mahogany table and slid a single sheet of heavy stock paper across the polished surface. It was a formal settlement offer. He was offering me a completely staggering sum of money. It was enough capital to quietly walk away, start my own massive rival firm, and never have to look at another infrastructure contract or deal with a board of directors for the rest of my natural life. His only condition was that I immediately drop all legal contestations, formally sign away my controlling voting shares, and completely disappear so the scandal could quietly die. He said the negative press was severely damaging the overall company valuation and threatening our credit ratings with the major banks. He said it was strictly a business decision to keep things quiet and protect the legacy. That precise moment was the absolute lowest point of my entire life. The deepest, most agonizing pain did not come from the harsh scientific reality that I did not share his direct DNA. It did not even come from the devastating realization that he had allowed Evelyn to publicly humiliate me in a crowded room. The true, soul-crushing heartbreak was looking down at that piece of paper and realizing my father genuinely believed my entire existence had a specific purchase price. He honestly thought my nearly 40 years of absolute loyalty, my grueling late nights saving his failing regional branches, and my entire childhood spent worshiping the ground he walked on could all be neatly converted into a massive cash settlement. He was willing to simply write a check to make his daughter vanish, just to protect his fragile pride and his stock price. I did not touch the paper. I simply stood up from the heavy leather executive chair. I looked directly into his tired, cowardly eyes, and I spoke with a voice completely devoid of any remaining affection or familial warmth. I told him bluntly that I was not fighting this brutal legal war just to keep the name Ward printed on my corporate letterhead. I told him I did not care about the money he was offering to buy my silence. I was fighting because I absolutely refused to let the incredibly hard-fought empire my mother literally bled to build fall into the greasy hands of thieves who used our private family trauma as a tool for corporate embezzlement. I told him he had completely sold his soul to protect a pathetic lie, but I was not going to let him sell my mother's legacy to cover his new wife's theft. I turned my back on him and walked out of the glass room without waiting for his response. The man I had known as my father died for me in that exact moment. When the sun rose the following morning, I walked back through the heavy wooden doors of the Chancery Court in Wilmington. I felt entirely different. The oppressive weight of family expectation and the desperate, pathetic need for a father's approval had completely evaporated from my shoulders. The opposing counsel was already sitting at their table, confidently preparing to deliver their final, fatal blow regarding my lack of biological lineage. Evelyn was already wearing her perfectly practiced look of solemn, inevitable victory. Miles was adjusting his expensive silk tie, completely unaware of the absolute hellfire waiting for him. I sat down slowly next to Naomi. I did not feel like a broken, discarded child begging a judge for legal recognition anymore. As I placed my hands flat against the cool surface of the defense table, I felt a deep, dangerous surge of absolute power. I was the only person in that entire courtroom who truly understood the exact structural integrity of the Ward Meridian Empire. And more importantly, I was the only person who possessed the hard, irrefutable evidence proving exactly who was actively destroying it from the inside out. I was no longer playing defense. I was bringing the entire building down on their heads. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut. The second session convened precisely at 10 o'clock in the morning. The air was remarkably stale, thick with the suffocating tension of a public execution about to commence. Opposing counsel, the tall man with the sharp, predatory features, stood up from his chair. He smoothed his incredibly expensive suit jacket and addressed the presiding judge with the dripping, undeniable confidence of a man who firmly believed the war was already won. He formally entered the shortened, heavily redacted genetic test into the official court record. He spoke in a loud, highly resonant voice, deliberately ensuring the financial reporters sitting in the back rows captured every single syllable for their evening publications. He declared that due to the absolute lack of direct biological paternity, the recently drafted bloodline clause must be immediately activated. He requested a swift, merciless ruling from the bench to sever me entirely from the family trust and permanently revoke my executive voting shares in the corporate parent company. The judge turned his attention to our side of the room. He looked down at Naomi Sloan. He asked if the defense had any immediate objections to the scientific validity of the medical documents submitted by the plaintiff. Naomi stood up slowly. She did not rush. She calmly buttoned her stark black blazer. The entire gallery leaned forward collectively, bracing for a desperate, frantic legal objection. Across the wide aisle, Evelyn sat perfectly straight, a razor-thin, deeply satisfied smile playing on her lips. Miles leaned back comfortably in his heavy wooden chair, looking entirely bored by the procedural formalities of my destruction. Naomi looked directly at the judge. She stated in a clear, ringing voice that the defense had absolutely no objections to the genetic findings. She told the court that we completely and utterly agreed with the plaintiff. She explicitly stated that her client did not dispute the fact that Conrad Ward was not her direct biological father. The silence that violently crashed down on the courtroom was absolutely deafening. The frantic typing of the reporters stopped instantly. The investment bankers completely froze in their seats. Even the judge blinked rapidly, visibly taken aback by the sudden, unexpected capitulation. Across the aisle, my father exhaled a long, shaky breath of relief. Evelyn's smile widened into a look of absolute, terrifying triumph. They genuinely thought I was publicly surrendering. Then Naomi reached down and opened the heavy black leather box. She did not raise her voice. She did not utilize cheap theatrical gestures. She simply began to pull out a staggering mountain of paper, laying each piece onto the polished wood of the defense table like a card dealer laying out an unbeatable hand. She coldly informed the court that while we agreed with the shortened test, we fundamentally objected to the plaintiff deliberately submitting a fragmented half-truth to manipulate a judicial ruling. First, Naomi submitted the comprehensive, full-spectrum genealogical sequencing. She walked the judge through the complex data points, pointing out the incredibly high percentage of shared genetic markers between myself and the extended Ward family line. She established, unequivocally, that I was not a biological stranger to their blood. Next, she submitted the ancient, weathered medical affidavits from the defunct Virginia clinic. She submitted the faded financial invoices spanning decades. She submitted the chain of deeply personal letters between my mother and her former legal counsel. Each individual piece of paper struck the opposing table like a physical blow. The smug, arrogant confidence began to rapidly drain from the opposing counsel's face. But Naomi saved the absolutely lethal strike for last. She pulled out the certified, notarized medical consent form from the late 1980s. She requested the bailiff hand the document directly up to the judge. She announced to the completely silent room that this specific document contained the legally verified signature of Conrad Ward. She explained with surgical precision that by signing this exact document, Conrad had formally, legally, and permanently consented to an assisted reproductive procedure utilizing a donor from his own direct bloodline. I watched Evelyn's face closely. The physical transformation was absolute and horrifying to witness. The color completely vanished from her perfectly manicured skin. Her jaw tightened so intensely I thought her teeth might actually shatter under the pressure. She suddenly turned her head and stared violently at my father. In that exact fraction of a second, I realized the full depth of the betrayal playing out. Evelyn had only ever discovered the first half of the secret. She had found a medical discrepancy indicating I was not his biological child. She had built her entire hostile takeover strategy around that single fragile assumption. But my father, driven entirely by his suffocating masculine shame, had never told his new wife that he had actually signed legal paperwork authorizing my conception. He had lied to her as well. He had let her walk right into a legal slaughterhouse entirely blind to the massive weapon I was currently holding. Naomi continued her relentless assault. She turned her attention back to the bench. She argued forcefully that the highly disputed bloodline clause, the exact trap Evelyn had designed to destroy me, was fundamentally satisfied. The biological donor was highly probable to be Andrew Ward, my father's younger brother. Therefore, by absolute genetic definition, my blood belonged entirely to the Ward lineage. Furthermore, she argued that under the strict letter of state family law, my father's notarized signature on the medical consent form established irrevocable, ironclad legal paternity. He could not legally disown a child he had explicitly contracted to create. The atmosphere on the judge's bench shifted dramatically. The presiding judge leaned far forward, his brow furrowed in deep, angry concentration. He looked down at the documents, then glared sharply across the room at my father and his legal team. 10 minutes ago, he had viewed this case as a standard, somewhat messy dispute over trust fund technicalities and hurt family feelings. Now, his expression hardened into one of severe judicial suspicion. He was looking directly at a coordinated, highly manipulative attempt to distort medical facts and twist the court system to execute a corporate coup. He realized he was actively being used to facilitate a $5 billion theft. The invisible pressure in the room became absolute. The walls seemed to close in completely on the opposing table. And then, the weakest link in their armor finally snapped. Miles Cross shot up from his chair. His face was flushed a bright, feverish red. His carefully practiced corporate composure completely disintegrated under the intense pressure. He pointed a shaking finger at the table where the old medical forms lay. He shouted across the silent room, his voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. He aggressively demanded to know how we possessed those specific documents. He loudly proclaimed to the entire courtroom that those specific files were supposed to be completely gone. He yelled that they should not exist anymore. It was a catastrophic, unforced error. The entire courtroom drew a collective, sharp breath. Naomi did not miss a single beat. She spun around, her eyes locking onto Miles like a heat-seeking missile. Her voice cut through the heavy air, sharp and lethal. She immediately asked the court to note the severe implications of that outburst on the official record. She demanded to know why the vice president of strategy possessed intimate knowledge regarding the intended destruction of decades-old medical and legal archives. She loudly questioned who exactly had ordered the systematic deletion of those specific files from the secure corporate servers. She pivoted the entire narrative in a matter of seconds, transforming a messy family secret into a highly probable corporate cover-up involving the deliberate destruction of evidence. The opposing counsel scrambled desperately to quiet his client, violently pulling Miles back down into his seat by his jacket. The lawyer frantically requested an immediate sidebar, his face slick with nervous sweat. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down hard, the sharp crack echoing loudly. demanding immediate order in his courtroom. The hearing was far from over. There would undoubtedly be more motions filed, more furious arguments presented, and more complex legal maneuvering in the days to come, but the fundamental tide of the war had just irrevocably turned. I remained seated at my table, perfectly calm, breathing in the heavily air-conditioned air of the room. I looked across the wide aisle one last time. Evelyn Cross Ward was no longer sitting upright. Her shoulders had completely collapsed. Her hands gripped the edge of the wooden table so hard, her knuckles were completely white. She was staring blankly straight ahead at nothing at all. For years, she had carried herself with the untouchable arrogance of a queen slowly walking toward her inevitable coronation. But sitting there, completely exposed, outmaneuvered, and legally cornered, she looked like something else entirely. She looked exactly like a woman who had just heard the heavy steel door of her own prison cell slam permanently shut. My father was formally called to the witness stand. The heavy wooden chair seemed to swallow him whole. He placed his right hand on the Bible and swore to tell the whole truth, an oath that sounded incredibly hollow echoing in the vast courtroom. Naomi Sloan did not pace. She stood perfectly still at the podium, holding the certified medical consent form like a loaded weapon. She asked him directly to identify the black ink scrawled across the bottom line. The silence stretched on for several agonizing seconds. The entire gallery held its collective breath. Finally, in a voice barely above a raspy whisper, the founder of the massive infrastructure empire leaned into the microphone and admitted it was his signature. Under Naomi's relentless surgical questioning, the heavily fortified dam completely broke. My father was forced to publicly confess the exact reality he had spent nearly 40 years desperately trying to bury. He admitted that long before I was even a concept, he had received a devastating medical diagnosis. He was entirely sterile. He told the court how my mother had proposed the assisted reproductive procedure. He confessed that he had agreed to use his younger brother as the biological donor, but only under the strict, unbreakable condition that I would be raised exclusively as his own flesh and blood. He demanded absolute secrecy. Naomi asked him why. She asked why a man who could easily bend municipal governments to his will and build bridges out of solid steel was so terrified of a simple medical reality. His answer was not the defiant roar of a titan. It was the pathetic, trembling rationalization of a deeply insecure man. He looked down at his incredibly expensive leather shoes and confessed that in the aggressive male-dominated corporate culture of the late 1980s, a man who could not produce an heir was viewed as fundamentally flawed. He was terrified that his early financial backers, the ruthless Wall Street investors who provided the initial capital for his company, would see him as weak. He was paralyzed by the thought that his business rivals would secretly laugh at him in the locker rooms of their exclusive country clubs. He had spent his entire adult life projecting an aura of absolute, unconquerable American masculinity, and he believed this biological truth would completely shatter that carefully curated illusion. Then, the true nature of his betrayal was dragged into the harsh fluorescent light. Naomi pivoted to the timeline following my mother's death. She forced him to explain exactly how his second wife became involved in the erasure of my history. My father admitted that he had kept the medical files hidden in his private study. A few years after he married Evelyn, she had been rummaging through his locked desk and accidentally discovered a faded, handwritten memo from the fertility clinic. She did not bring it to him with sympathy. She weaponized it. Evelyn delivered a cold, calculated ultimatum behind closed doors. She told him that unless he systematically removed me from the executive succession plan and cleared the path for her own son, she would leak the medical documents to the national financial press. She threatened to expose his lifelong secret to the board of directors, the shareholders, and the very rivals he feared so deeply. Instead of standing up to the blackmail, instead of protecting the child he had explicitly contracted to bring into the world, my father chose the path of least emotional resistance. He chose himself. He confessed on the stand that he began to actively manipulate his own conscience. He convinced himself that since I did not share his exact genetic code, Pushing me out of the company was a logical, necessary business decision rather than a profound moral failure. He allowed Evelyn to draft the new bloodline clauses and slowly strip away my authority, because it was easier to sacrifice my entire future than to face the public embarrassment of his own sterility. He stopped speaking. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the faint ticking of the heavy brass clock on the far wall. The man sitting on the stand was not a victim of a shocking revelation. He was an architect of his own cowardly demise. I did not scream. I did not pound my fists on the table or burst into dramatic tears. The profound, suffocating anger I felt was completely icy and totally controlled. I stood up from my chair at the defense table. The judge did not reprimand me for breaking protocol. He simply watched me. I looked directly into the hollow, exhausted eyes of the man who had raised me, and I asked him a single, devastating question. I asked if the true reason he had thrown me to the wolves was not because he had suddenly discovered a horrible truth, but simply because he could not stomach the idea of the world finding out that he had known the truth all along. I watched his throat swallow hard. His mouth opened slightly, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked desperately around the room, searching for a lifeline, an objection, a distraction, anything to save him from the crushing weight of that question, but there was nothing. He just sat there, frozen under the blinding lights. His total, paralyzing silence was significantly heavier and infinitely more damning than any verbal confession he could have possibly offered. He had traded my life for his pride, and now he had lost both. Naomi was not finished. She did not allow the opposing side a single moment to recover their breath. She smoothly shifted her focus away from the shattered patriarch and aimed her crosshairs directly at the opposing table. She submitted a brand new stack of documents to the clerk. They were legal family registry files. With ruthless efficiency, she exposed the final, fatal structural flaw in Evelyn's grand design. While Evelyn had spent years aggressively weaponizing my lack of direct biological connection to the founder, she had deliberately ignored her own son's glaring legal vulnerabilities. Naomi proved with certified state records that my father had never formally, legally adopted Miles. There was absolutely no legal paperwork binding Miles to the Ward family trust as an official dependent or heir. Evelyn had operated on the incredibly arrogant assumption that by simply marrying the king, her son would automatically inherit the entire kingdom by default once the biological daughter was executed. She had focused entirely on drafting bloodline clauses to exclude me, completely failing to realize that those exact same exclusionary clauses inherently barred her own unadopted son from holding any executive voting power. Her position as the mother of the presumed heir was a complete legal fiction. This devastating reality was established even before Naomi intended to introduce the massive financial fraud and the fake consulting firm into the civil record. The fundamental narrative inside the courtroom shifted with the force of a massive earthquake. The dozens of reporters, the nervous bankers, and the silent board members sitting in the gallery were no longer watching a tragic, emotional dispute over who possessed the correct DNA sequence. They had been dragged completely past the illusion of bloodline purity. They were now staring at the stark, ugly reality of corporate and familial warfare. It was entirely about who had actually put on the boots and poured the concrete. It was about who held the legally binding paperwork. It was about who had spent years manipulating an old man's insecurities. And most importantly, it was about a group of people who were cruel and desperate enough to label a living, breathing human being as a mere biological mistake just to steal control of a $5 billion empire. The illusion of the untouchable aristocratic family was dead. We were just scavengers fighting in the dirt, but I was the only one holding the shovel. The presiding judge called for an extended recess to review the overwhelming mountain of supplementary files Naomi had just dumped onto the official record. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, and the gallery spilled out into the sprawling marble hallways of the Chancery Court. The air out there was thick with frantic whispers, the furious tapping of leather shoes, and the sharp scent of stale coffee and nervous perspiration. I did not join the crowd. I stood near a massive stone pillar, letting the cold air from the overhead vents wash over my face. That was when Judith Mercer approached me. My aunt moved with a quiet, understated grace that felt entirely foreign in this building full of aggressive corporate predators. She did not offer me hollow words of comfort. Instead, she reached into her large leather handbag and pulled out a deeply weathered, thick manila envelope. The edges were soft and frayed from decades of hidden storage. She pressed it firmly into my hands. She told me my mother had mailed this envelope to the West Coast over 20 years ago. Claire had given Judith one absolute, unbreakable directive regarding its delivery. She was only to hand it over if Conrad ever allowed his suffocating pride to bring actual harm to me. I walked away from the crowded corridor and found an empty, heavily soundproofed witness consultation room. I closed the heavy door, shutting out the noise of the corporate slaughter happening outside. I sat down at a small laminate table and carefully tore open the brittle seal of the envelope. Inside were 2 separate letters. I recognized my mother's sweeping, elegant handwriting instantly. The ink was slightly faded, but the sheer force of her conviction bled through every single word. She wrote that she knew the silence would eventually become a heavy burden, but she wanted me to understand the profound truth behind my existence. She wrote that I was never an accident, nor was I a mere medical transaction. She explicitly stated that I was a child chosen twice. I was chosen first by her absolute, agonizingly fierce desire to become a mother. I was chosen second by the deliberate, voluntary stroke of my father's pen on a legal consent form. She wrote that this dual choice made me infinitely more legitimate and deeply wanted than any child born through simple, traditional biology. Claire also revealed the exact nature of the silent pact she had made with Andrew. She wrote that Andrew had absolutely refused to let me grow up as a half-kept secret or an unspoken shadow haunting the family estate. He only agreed to the biological donation because he genuinely believed Conrad would step up and be a true, unwavering legal father. Andrew believed that bloodline should be a quiet, private foundation for life, not a sharpened weapon to be wielded in a corporate boardroom. I set my mother's letter down and picked up the second piece of paper. The handwriting was completely different, sharp and slightly hurried. It was from Andrew Ward. It was penned shortly before his tragic death. Written to a daughter he would never legally claim or truly know. The letter was not filled with dramatic declarations of lost love. It was a stark, profound plea for my future character. He wrote that if the day ever came when the family turned on me, if I ever found myself backed into a corner needing to protect my life, I must do so with absolute dignity. He warned me against the intoxicating allure of blind, scorched earth destruction. He urged me to remember that true power does not come from burning the house down, but from standing firmly in the truth while the liars burn themselves. The profound, aching silence of the small room was suddenly shattered when the heavy door swung open. Naomi Sloan walked in. She was not walking with her usual cold, measured pace. She moved with the terrifying, kinetic energy of a controlled explosion. She locked the door behind her and slapped a thick, freshly printed forensic binder onto the table right next to my letters. Our independent financial and digital forensic team had been working relentlessly through the night, ripping apart the server logs and metadata of the family trust documents. They had just found the ultimate, fatal blow. Naomi leaned over the table, her eyes completely devoid of mercy. She pointed a sharp finger at a highly magnified digital ledger. She explained that the infamous bloodline clause, the exact legal mechanism Evelyn had used to drag me into this courtroom, was completely fraudulent. The forensic digital analysis proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the exclusionary paragraph did not exist in the original draft of the trust amendment. The timestamps embedded deep within the digital signatures were completely disjointed. The file had been illegally reopened, retroactively altered to include the bloodline restriction, and then fraudulently sealed with forged digital credentials mere weeks before they launched their attack against me. The sheer scale of their arrogance was staggering. Evelyn and Miles had not simply exploited a deeply painful medical secret regarding my DNA. They had actively committed felony document forgery. They had deliberately tampered with binding legal inheritance files, transforming an old man's personal wound into an illegal instrument designed to steal absolute control of a $5 billion enterprise. They were not just corporate opportunists, they were outright criminals. I carefully folded the letters from my mother and Andrew and placed them securely into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket. I walked out of the consultation room with Naomi right beside me. We marched back down the long marble corridor toward the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. Conrad Ward was waiting for me near the entrance. He had completely lost the polished, commanding aura of an industry titan. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of a man, desperately treading water in a storm he had created. He stepped directly into my path, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. He begged me for a private moment. His voice trembled violently as he pleaded with me not to introduce the digital forensic evidence to the judge. He knew exactly what the forged timestamps meant. He realized his new wife and her son were facing severe criminal indictments. He looked at me with desperate, terrified eyes and begged me to bury the forgery report. He told me that if I submitted those findings, the ensuing criminal investigation would completely shatter the Ward Meridian stock price. He whispered frantically that the family reputation would die a brutal, public death. I stopped walking. I stood mere inches from him, looking directly into the cowardly eyes I used to search for approval. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal clarity that cut straight through the noise of the crowded hallway. I told him that he had absolutely no right to lecture me about preserving the family reputation. I told him the reputation of this family did not die today because of forged digital timestamps or fraudulent consulting firms. I looked at him and delivered the final, absolute truth. I told him the legacy died the exact second he chose to sit at a table in a public courtroom and deliberately erase his own daughter's name just to protect his pathetic ego. He physically recoiled, as if I had struck him across the face. He had absolutely nothing left to say. There were no more lies to spin, no more corporate buzzwords to hide behind. I turned away from him and faced the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. The bailiff announced that the final session was preparing to resume. I took a deep, steadying breath. I was no longer walking back into that room to beg a judge to restore my position on an executive board. I was not there to ask for my job back. I was walking through those doors to permanently execute a massive, toxic system of lies that every single person around me had treated as a sacred tradition for far too long. I pushed the heavy doors open and walked back into the light. The final session of the Chancery Court convened with a heavy, suffocating silence. The air in the room felt entirely different now. The arrogant, predatory energy that had previously radiated from the opposing table was completely gone, replaced by the sour, undeniable stench of absolute panic. Naomi Sloan did not waste a single second with theatrical legal posturing. She walked directly to the center podium and delivered the final, fatal sequence of evidence with the cold, mechanical precision of a firing squad. She laid out the 4 indisputable pillars of our absolute victory for the judge. First, she pointed to the certified medical documents proving my father was my completely valid, legal parent due to his own voluntary notarized signature on the reproductive consent forms. Second, she reiterated the advanced genetic sequencing that firmly established my place within the Ward bloodline through his brother Andrew. Third, and most devastatingly, she presented the independent digital forensics report. Naomi placed the massive stack of server logs directly onto the bench. She explained in a sharp, ringing voice that the critical digital timestamps proved the exclusionary bloodline clause was a complete legal fabrication. The original family trust documents had been illegally reopened and retroactively altered weeks after I had begun heavily questioning the suspicious corporate succession plans. Finally, she submitted the massive stack of banking ledgers, tying the fraudulent consulting firm known as Blue Basin Strategies directly to Miles Cross and his mother. Naomi explicitly stated that the opposing side was not motivated by a sudden, righteous desire to protect the genetic purity of the family tree. They had orchestrated this entire brutal public execution to forcibly remove me from the executive floor because I was the only person capable of uncovering their massive, multi-million-dollar financial theft. The presiding judge did not call for another recess. He did not need days to deliberate over the overwhelming mountain of undeniable proof. He looked down from his elevated bench, his face completely hardened into a mask of severe judicial disgust. He directed his piercing gaze straight at my father. He delivered a blistering, echoing reprimand that filled every corner of the large room. He stated with absolute clarity that the court system would not be utilized as a weapon to facilitate corporate embezzlement. He told my father that a man absolutely cannot use a fragmented, highly convenient medical test to spontaneously annul nearly 40 years of established, legally binding parenthood. He declared it fundamentally repulsive that a father would attempt to legally erase the very heir he actively contracted to create, raised under his own roof, and empowered to run his massive operations for decades. With a swift, highly aggressive motion, the judge struck the manipulated trust amendment from the legal record entirely. He declared the forged documents completely null and void. He formally restored the original corporate voting structure that my mother had helped establish so many years ago. Then, he picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He brought it down against the sounding block with a sharp, violent crack that sounded like a gunshot. With that single strike, he legally and permanently recognized me as the sole, rightful controlling heir to the disputed equity and the absolute executive authority of Ward Meridian infrastructure. The immediate fallout was a total, brutal annihilation of the enemy camp. Evelyn Cross Ward sat completely paralyzed in her chair. Her immaculate composure had totally disintegrated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a woman who finally realized she had flown entirely too close to the sun. The judge was not finished. He formally announced from the bench that he was referring the millions of dollars tied to Blue Basin Strategies directly to the state prosecutors for immediate civil and criminal investigations. Miles was instantly and permanently ejected from the line of succession. Evelyn was immediately stripped of her powerful seats on the family board and the philanthropic foundation. They had walked into this courtroom expecting to steal a $5 billion empire. They were walking out with absolutely nothing but impending criminal indictments and total public ruin. The gallery slowly emptied out into the sprawling marble hallways. I packed my heavy leather briefcase with steady, highly controlled movements. When I finally walked out through the heavy oak doors, my father was waiting for me near a massive stone column. He looked incredibly small. The terrifying aura of the ruthless industry titan had completely evaporated, leaving behind a tired, broken old man who was desperately treading water in a massive storm he had created himself. He stepped directly into my path. He raised his shaking hands and tried to offer a pathetic, trembling apology. He wanted a quiet, easy reconciliation to soothe his completely shattered conscience. He wanted me to tell him that despite the brutal betrayal, we were still family. I did not give him the satisfaction of a screaming match. I did not offer him a tearful, emotional embrace. I looked at him with absolute, freezing detachment. I told him I did not want his apologies. I told him he would have to spend the rest of his empty, silent life living with one single, agonizing truth. I looked directly into his terrified eyes and said that the exact ink he used to secretly authorize my existence, the signature he tried so desperately to run away from, was the exact weapon that ultimately saved me from his cowardly public denial. I did not wait for his response. I simply turned my back and walked away, leaving him standing completely alone in the cold marble hallway. My ultimate revenge was not a reckless, emotional destruction of the company name. I absolutely refused to burn my mother's incredible legacy to the ground just to satisfy my own anger. Instead, I took absolute, terrifying control of it. Within 48 hours of the final judicial ruling, I initiated a ruthless, comprehensive top-to-bottom financial audit of the entire corporate structure. I immediately fired every single executive and board member who had quietly enabled Evelyn and her son. I completely restructured the family trust to ensure no parasite could ever attach themselves to our labor again. Most importantly, I redirected a massive portion of the family philanthropic foundation to officially establish the Claire Andrew Initiative. It was a highly funded, incredibly aggressive legal defense fund specifically designed to support adults who were trapped in highly complex, predatory legal disputes involving sealed reproductive records, hidden adoptions, and stolen personal identity. I took the exact toxic secrecy that had nearly destroyed my life and transformed it into a blinding spotlight to protect others. A week later, I walked into the massive, glass-walled executive boardroom on the top floor of the corporate tower. It was a rainy Tuesday morning. The sprawling city stretched out endlessly below me, completely ignorant of the brutal war that had just been waged for its infrastructure. I took my seat at the absolute head of the long mahogany table. I was facing the massive corporate empire that had actively tried to chew me up and spit me out. In the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket, I could feel the heavy paper of my mother's hidden letter resting quietly against my chest. As the newly appointed, deeply terrified board members took their seats in absolute silence, waiting for my first command, a profound truth settled deeply into my bones. It was a truth sharp enough to cut through any corporate lie or forged document. Blood might be the biological spark that initiates a family line, but blood alone is incredibly cheap. Only absolute truth, grueling physical labor, and unbreakable courage truly decide who is ultimately worthy enough to keep the empire. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know in the comments exactly where in the world you are listening from, so we can interact and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.